Detective Mark Sullivan, the relentless investigator, and undercover agent Elena Petrova, fearless and cunning, never imagined that the streets of Liverpool would become a battlefield. As crime lord Vasil Krasniqi expanded his ruthless empire across the city, and corrupt official Ricci secretly aided his operations, an invisible war erupted, one that would leave the entire city trembling in fear. Liverpool's bustling streets were alive with the usual rhythm of city life, the clatter of trams, the chatter of tourists along the waterfront, and the distant roar of football fans heading toward Anfield and Goodison Park. But beneath this vibrant surface, a darker world was slowly taking shape. Shadows moved where no one looked, and the city's familiar streets, once thought safe, were beginning to harbor secrets that would soon terrify its residents. Ordinary citizens went about their daily routines, unaware that their city was becoming a playground for international crime rings. The first signs were subtle. A few shops reporting small but inexplicable thefts, delivery trucks disappearing with cargo, and whispers in local neighborhoods of people vanishing without explanation. These incidents, though seemingly isolated, were the first hints of a meticulously orchestrated network that spanned countries and continents. No one could have predicted how quickly the syndicates would entrench themselves in Liverpool. The criminal organizations were not like the petty gangs the city had dealt with before. They were highly organized, ruthless, and strategic, their operations honed by years of international experience. They moved with precision, smuggling drugs, weapons, and even human lives under the cover of night. Dockyards became entry points for illicit shipments, hidden among legitimate cargo. Nightclubs, once merely spaces for music and laughter, transformed into meeting points for deals that carried deadly consequences. Even ordinary neighborhoods were touched, with abandoned warehouses repurposed for secret operations and safe houses scattered across the city. Residents began to notice the changes, but could not explain them. Security cameras captured fleeting glimpses of masked figures disappearing down alleyways. Drivers reported being followed by unknown cars at night, and some claimed to see strangers watching from across the streets. The ordinary sounds of the city sirens, distant traffic, and barking dogs suddenly felt different. They were no longer signs of life, but subtle warnings that danger was nearby. Fear began to grow quietly, like a slow, creeping fog. People stopped walking alone at night. Shopkeepers hesitated to leave their stores after closing, and parents worried about letting their children play outside. The local police were stretched thin. Cases of petty theft and vandalism were handled regularly, but the scale and sophistication of these new crimes were overwhelming. Officers struggled to connect the dots, unable to trace the origins of stolen goods or identify the masked figures who seemed always one step ahead. The international nature of the syndicates made investigations even more challenging. Leads vanished across borders, and every time a breakthrough seemed within reach. The criminals had already disappeared, leaving nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread. Liverpool's identity was being reshaped by these unseen forces. Streets that once symbolized resilience and community began to feel unsafe. The sense of pride the city had always carried was now mixed with anxiety. Ordinary citizens sensed a change they could not name, a subtle but pervasive feeling that the city they knew was slipping into the hands of forces much larger than themselves. And as the first layer of fear settled over Liverpool, no one realized that this was only the beginning. What lay ahead would push the city into darkness, testing the courage of its people and the limits of its law enforcement. As the invisible enemy tightened its grip, leaving the city trembling under the weight of a threat few could see, but everyone could feel. The first whispers of foreign criminal syndicates had barely settled when Liverpool began to feel the full force of their presence. These were not ordinary gangs. They were well-funded, highly organized, and experienced in operating across multiple countries. Their arrival was quiet at first, almost imperceptible, like ripples spreading across a still pond. But soon their influence became undeniable. Shipping containers at the docks, once a routine part of international trade, were now being used to smuggle drugs, weapons, and other illicit goods. No one knew exactly how they arrived or who was assisting them, but the evidence was unmistakable. Liverpool had become a strategic hub for international crime. The syndicates came from regions known for their ruthless criminal operations: Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, and even North Africa. Each group had its specialty. Some were experts in trafficking narcotics, others in smuggling weapons, and still others in human trafficking, moving people across borders with shocking efficiency. They were not limited by the city's geography or the law. They bribed officials, manipulated local networks, and created alliances with smaller gangs already operating in Liverpool. In doing so, they embedded themselves into the city's economic and social structure, making it increasingly difficult for authorities to pinpoint their activities. The local population began to notice subtle changes. Nightclubs that once attracted tourists and music lovers were now hotbeds of suspicious activity. Delivery trucks disappeared under the cover of darkness, only to reappear in unexpected locations. Ordinary businesses, from car dealerships to convenience stores, were being used as fronts for money laundering and other criminal operations. People reported seeing strangers, observing neighborhoods with intense focus, as if mapping the city for future raids or transactions. Even the most familiar districts, with their bright lights and busy streets, were no longer immune to danger. Liverpool had been quietly transformed into a city under siege, though many residents remained unaware of the scope of the threat. Police forces were under immense pressure. Routine investigations into petty crimes now collided with the complexity of international criminal operations. Officers discovered financial transactions stretching across multiple countries, shipments that vanished without a trace, and an intricate web of corruption that extended into institutions they had once trusted. Detectives realized that the criminals' success depended not only on secrecy, but also on their ability to manipulate ordinary life. By blending in with the city's normal rhythms, they were able to operate almost invisibly, leaving fear to spread quietly among those who sensed something was wrong, but could not name it. By the time the public began to grasp the situation, the syndicates had already solidified their foothold. Liverpool's streets, which had once been filled with the simple hum of city life, were now layered with tension. Citizens noticed armed men moving in the shadows, strangers who seemed to appear and disappear without explanation, and vehicles that prowled residential streets late at night. Fear became a constant companion. The city's character was shifting under the weight of this invisible threat, and the realization began to sink in. The syndicates were not temporary visitors. They had arrived with purpose, and their plans for Liverpool were only beginning to unfold. As the city slept fitfully, unaware of the international web growing around it, one truth became clear. Liverpool was no longer just a city of culture, football, and commerce. It had become a strategic battlefield, a crossroads for criminal empires that would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. And as the shadow of these syndicates spread, it became increasingly evident that the city's residents were living on borrowed time, caught in the grip of forces far larger than themselves. Liverpool's streets were no longer simply avenues of daily life. They had become part of an invisible web spun by criminal masterminds. Investigators began to uncover the extent of this network, realizing that the city was not just a target, it was a carefully chosen hub for operations that spanned continents. Front businesses, once thought harmless, were now being used to hide illegal activity. Car dealerships reported impressive sales, but behind closed doors, stolen vehicles were being modified and shipped abroad. Nightclubs flourished, drawing crowds with music and lights, while their basements stored contraband and served as secret meeting points. Shipping companies, long trusted to handle imports and exports, were transporting far more than goods. It became clear that these businesses were carefully designed facades, offering criminals legitimacy while hiding their dark dealings from the public eye. Financial investigations revealed astonishing amounts of money moving through accounts in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Transactions were layered, coded and deliberately obscured, leaving only faint traces for detectives to follow. The criminals were not only skilled at hiding physical evidence, but also at manipulating digital trails. Every time the authorities traced one link in the chain, another seemed to emerge elsewhere, suggesting a complex international collaboration. The sophistication of these operations left investigators both awed and alarmed. They were not dealing with ordinary criminals, but with individuals who had mastered the art of invisibility in plain sight. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered disturbing evidence of corruption within the city itself. Some officials and business owners were complicit, accepting bribes and favors in exchange for silence or cooperation. Meetings were held in private offices and secluded locations, where allegiances were forged and instructions passed down the criminal hierarchy. Even law enforcement officers, those sworn to protect the city, were not entirely immune. The realization that some of the very people meant to enforce the law might be aiding the syndicates shook the investigators to their core. Trust became a scarce commodity, and every alliance needed careful scrutiny. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens began sensing that something was deeply wrong. Shops reported unexpected break-ins and vanishing deliveries. Residents noticed unusual traffic patterns, suspicious individuals photographing streets, and cars that seemed to follow them for blocks. The once familiar cityscape of Liverpool, the markets, parks, and riverside promenades, was slowly becoming a place of fear and uncertainty. Neighborhoods that had thrived on community and camaraderie were now quiet, their residents wary of the unknown threats lurking nearby. The deeper the investigation went, the more intricate the web became. It was no longer just a local issue. Liverpool had become a node in a network connecting criminal syndicates across Europe and beyond. Human trafficking, drug smuggling, and illegal arms trading were coordinated with military-like precision. The city was simultaneously a battlefield and a marketplace, with criminals exploiting its resources while remaining mostly invisible to the public. The streets, once vibrant and lively, now carried an undercurrent of tension. Every delivery, every meeting, and every transaction could have consequences that would ripple through the city, affecting lives in ways that were impossible to predict. Liverpool was awakening to a grim reality. The city was ensnared in an invisible, intricate web. The syndicates had not only arrived, they had rooted themselves deeply within the social and economic fabric. Fear and uncertainty had become constant companions for the residents, as the city's very identity began to shift under the weight of this international criminal network. The invisible web had woven itself tightly, leaving few places untouched and few people untouched by the sense that something larger, darker, and more dangerous than ever imagined had arrived in Liverpool, and it was here to stay. Violence began creeping into Liverpool like a storm that no one had seen coming. What had started as quiet infiltration by international crime rings soon erupted into bold and brutal displays of power. The criminals were no longer content with working silently in the shadows. They wanted to dominate the streets, and they used fear as their weapon of choice. Crimes that once shocked the city became frighteningly common. Residents who had never worried about walking home after dark now rushed indoors before sunset, locking their doors with trembling hands. The first major incident occurred late one evening when an armored van carrying high-value electronics was ambushed in broad daylight. The attack was swift and ruthless. The criminals executed the operation with military-like precision, shutting down traffic, blocking exits, and disappearing before police could even respond. The incident sent shockwaves through the city. It showed that the syndicates were not just powerful, they were fearless. They operated with the confidence of men who knew they were untouchable. Soon after, drive-by shootings became a chilling routine. Unknown vehicles sped through residential streets, spraying bullets at rival targets. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire, leaving families shattered and neighborhoods traumatized. Streets that once echoed with children's laughter now fell silent, replaced by the constant wail of sirens. Crime scenes grew in number, each marked by flashing lights, forensic tents, and crowds of terrified locals watching from behind their curtains. But the violence did not stop there. A shocking explosion rocked one of the busiest districts in the city, damaging cars, shops, and residential buildings. Smoke billowed into the sky as firefighters battled the flames through the night. Investigators later learned the explosion was not random. It was a message, a warning directed at a rival criminal group that had attempted to interfere with a shipment coming through the docks. The syndicates had shown they were willing to destroy anything and anyone to protect their operations. Those who lived near the docks suffered the most. Strange containers arrived at odd hours, escorted by armed men. Residents heard the low rumble of trucks moving through the night, carrying unknown goods to unknown destinations. People reported seeing masked individuals standing guard on rooftops and alleyways, monitoring every movement. Even the police hesitated to approach these areas, overwhelmed by the danger and lack of resources. Fear spread like wildfire. Local shop owners closed early, taxis refused to enter certain neighborhoods, and families avoided public events. The criminals used intimidation to maintain control, leaving threatening symbols on doors and walls. Rumors circulated about people who tried to speak out, only to vanish without a trace. The city felt like it was being held hostage, trapped under a blanket of terror that only grew heavier with each passing day. Liverpool, a place known for resilience and unity, was now fractured by fear. Its streets had become battlegrounds, its residents unwilling witnesses to a war between unseen forces. The international crime rings were not just present, they were in command. Their violence was not random, but strategic, designed to ensure that everyone understood who held the real power. And as the city struggled to make sense of the chaos, one thing became disturbingly clear. The worst was yet to come. The chaos engulfing Liverpool forced law enforcement to consider desperate measures. The traditional methods of investigation were failing against the international crime rings, whose operations were too sophisticated, too well hidden, and too deeply embedded in the city's fabric. A small, highly trained group of detectives was assembled to infiltrate the syndicates from within. These officers were experienced, skilled, and mentally prepared for the dangers ahead, yet even they understood that this assignment was unlike anything they had faced before. They had to disappear from their normal lives, assume false identities, and step into a world where trust was a luxury and hesitation could mean death. Their mission began in the darkest corners of the city's criminal underworld. They posed as smugglers, enforcers, and intermediaries seeking work within the syndicates. To blend in, they adopted the mannerisms, clothing, and behavior of those they aimed to expose. They visited nightclubs known for illegal activity, met with low-level operatives, and slowly worked their way into circles where deals were made and alliances were formed. Every interaction was a test, every meeting a risk. They had to prove their loyalty through small tasks, each one pulling them deeper into the murky operations of the criminal networks. As the detectives grew closer to the syndicates, they uncovered disturbing details about the scale of the operations. The criminals were not acting alone. They were connected to powerful networks spanning several countries. Drugs were transported from one nation, laundered through another, and delivered through Liverpool as part of a global distribution chain. The detectives discovered routes that bypassed law enforcement entirely, hidden tunnels, secret storage facilities, and coded shipment schedules. The deeper they went, the more they realized how meticulously planned everything was. Each syndicate had its own hierarchy, its own rules, and its own methods of protecting its empire. Working undercover came with constant danger. The detectives lived in fear of being exposed. They carried hidden recording devices and memorized complex cover stories. But even the smallest mistake could unravel their entire mission. Several times, they were questioned by suspicious criminals who sensed something unusual. They endured intimidation, surveillance, and unexpected tests designed to reveal betrayal. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, with no safety net below. Despite the risks, the undercover team continued to gather critical evidence. They traced drug shipments to hidden warehouses, identified key figures behind human trafficking operations, and uncovered financial links between the syndicates and corrupt officials. But the more they learned, the heavier their burden became. The information they discovered revealed that the crime rings were far more entrenched than anyone had feared. Liverpool was not simply a transit point. It had become a command center for several international networks working together. The detectives often met in secret to exchange information, knowing that being seen together could jeopardize everything. Their progress came at a personal cost. They lost sleep, distanced themselves from loved ones, and carried the emotional weight of witnessing the darkest side of humanity up close. What kept them going was the realization that the fate of the city depended on their success. They were the silent eyes inside an empire of crime, gathering evidence piece by piece, knowing that one wrong step could bring everything crashing down. Liverpool had no idea that a hidden battle was unfolding in its darkest corners. And while the undercover detectives continued their dangerous work, the criminal syndicates tightened their operations, preparing for a storm they did not yet see coming. The city's future hung on the fragile thread of secrecy, courage, and time. The undercover operation had reached a critical point when an unexpected discovery shattered everything the detectives believed about the investigation. For months, they had suspected the criminal syndicates were receiving help from inside the city, but they never expected the betrayal to come from people positioned at the highest levels of authority. It began with small inconsistencies, cases that were suddenly closed without explanation, suspects who vanished moments before arrest, and confidential plans leaked before officers even had time to act. Each incident seemed isolated, but together they formed a troubling pattern too precise to ignore. One detective stumbled upon the truth in the most unexpected way. While reviewing financial records gathered during an undercover transaction, he noticed a series of deposits linked to a senior official. The amounts were too large to be accidental and too frequent to be dismissed. Further investigation revealed coded messages exchanged between the official and members of the syndicates. Meetings had been held in secluded areas, often under the guise of business trips or community events. The official was not merely accepting bribes. He was actively guiding the criminals, providing them protection, information, and access to resources meant for the city's defense. The more the detectives uncovered, the deeper the betrayal ran. They found evidence suggesting that additional high-ranking individuals were involved, including influential business owners and even certain members of law enforcement. These collaborators acted as shields for the syndicates, ensuring that their operations went unchallenged. Arrest warrants were delayed, patrol routes were altered to avoid key transaction points, and information about raids was leaked in advance. Every protective barrier the police believed they had was compromised by someone pretending to work for the city's safety. The undercover team was stunned. Not only were they battling criminals armed with global networks and vast resources, but they were also fighting shadows within their own institutions. The trust they once placed in fellow officers evaporated as suspicion grew. Every conversation, every document, every routine procedure became a potential trap. They could no longer rely on official channels for support. Each step had to be taken carefully, quietly, and without drawing attention. The detectives realized that one wrong move could expose the entire operation, putting their lives in immediate danger. As they continued digging, they learned that the syndicates had used intimidation, blackmail, and temptation to pull officials into their control. Some were threatened with violence against their families, while others were lured by promises of wealth and influence. The web of corruption was so tightly woven that unraveling it felt almost impossible. But the undercover detectives refused to back down. They knew that exposing this internal betrayal was the key to dismantling the syndicate's power. Without inside protection, the criminals would lose their ability to operate freely. The detectives worked in near isolation, sharing information only within the small group they trusted. They gathered evidence quietly, storing it in secure locations far from police headquarters. Each new discovery pulled them deeper into danger, yet also closer to the truth. But the criminals were not oblivious. Strange cars began tailing the detectives. Anonymous threats appeared in hidden places. The walls were closing in, and the line between the hunters and the hunted grew dangerously thin. Liverpool was facing not only an external invasion, but a corruption that had infected its core. And as the undercover team navigated this treacherous landscape, they realized that the battle ahead would be the most difficult yet. They were fighting criminals on the streets and traitors within their ranks. The city's hope depended on exposing the betrayal before the betrayers silenced them forever. After months of careful planning and high-risk operations, the investigation finally reached a turning point. The undercover detectives had pieced together the syndicate's network, mapping the locations of warehouses, shipment routes, and key figures. One particular warehouse near the docks stood out. It was heavily guarded, almost invisible from the street, and consistently used for incoming shipments. Intelligence suggested that it contained drugs, weapons, and documents that could finally expose the full scope of the criminal empire operating in Liverpool. The authorities knew that acting without precise timing or coordination could result in disaster, but the opportunity was too critical to delay. The raid was meticulously coordinated with international agencies, including Europol and Interpol. Simultaneous operations were planned across multiple countries to ensure that the syndicate's global network could be disrupted at the same time. In Liverpool, officers approached the warehouse at dawn when the guards were least alert. Surveillance drones provided real-time information, revealing the movements of armed personnel inside and potential escape routes. The tension was palpable. One misstep could trigger violence or allow the criminals to destroy evidence before it could be secured. Inside the warehouse, officers discovered shocking amounts of contraband. Crates of narcotics were stacked neatly alongside hidden compartments containing firearms, ammunition, and tools used for trafficking. Human trafficking records were found, including lists of names, routes, and financial transactions. The scale of the operation left even experienced officers stunned. It was clear that Liverpool had been a central hub for an international web of crime, and the warehouse was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The evidence gathered would provide prosecutors with the material needed to bring down some of the city's most dangerous criminal figures. Simultaneously, coordinated raids in other countries led to the arrest of key players who had orchestrated operations from abroad. The combined effort sent a powerful message to the syndicates. The city and its allies would not tolerate their influence. Front businesses were shuttered, shipments intercepted, and hidden financial accounts frozen. Liverpool's streets, once terrorized by masked figures and anonymous threats, began to feel the first signs of relief. Local residents watched as law enforcement took control, reclaiming neighborhoods that had long been under the shadow of fear. But even as arrests were made, it became clear that the syndicates had contingency plans. Some criminals vanished before they could be apprehended, leaving investigators with only fragments of their identities. Others had secret routes, backup contacts, and alternative locations for their operations. While the city celebrated the victories, officers knew that the threat was not completely eliminated. The syndicate's influence had been weakened, but their reach and knowledge could allow them to rebuild if vigilance waned. The success of the raids also exposed the depth of the corruption within Liverpool. Officials and business owners who had facilitated criminal operations were identified and removed from positions of power. The city faced a reckoning, confronting the betrayal that had allowed international crime rings to flourish unchecked. Public confidence in law enforcement and government institutions needed rebuilding, but the arrests marked a crucial step toward restoring the city's integrity. Liverpool, battered but unbroken, began to recover. Streets once dominated by fear saw more activity, businesses reopened, and citizens cautiously stepped back into public life. The operations had disrupted the criminal networks and delivered a decisive blow, but the scars remained. The city had survived, yet it had learned that even in a place as familiar and resilient as Liverpool, darkness could take root quickly. The streets were quieter now, but the lessons of vigilance, courage, and unity would linger, shaping the city for years to come. Even after the coordinated raids and arrests, Liverpool remained a city haunted by the memory of fear. Streets that had once echoed with laughter and music now carried the quiet reminders of what had transpired. The international syndicates had left their mark, and although their most visible operations were dismantled, the city knew that the influence of such networks could never be entirely erased. Residents who had witnessed violence, disappearances, and intimidation continued to live with caution, their sense of security forever altered. The terror that had gripped neighborhoods for months had left psychological scars, and rebuilding trust would take years, if not decades. Investigators sifted through mountains of evidence recovered during the raids. They found detailed financial records, encrypted communications, and extensive documentation of trafficking routes that spanned multiple continents. Each discovery revealed new layers of complexity in the syndicate's operations. Authorities realized that while Liverpool had been a central hub, it was only one node in a global network that could continue to function without it. The criminals' ability to adapt and hide in plain sight was staggering, and law enforcement recognized that their victory, though significant, was not absolute. The city had survived a storm, but the threat remained ever present, lurking in the shadows where it could re-emerge. Community leaders and city officials began the long process of rebuilding. Programs were launched to support victims of violence and trafficking. Neighborhoods invested in security measures, and citizens organized to watch over their own streets. The arrests had removed many of the most dangerous figures, but the effort to restore a sense of normalcy required more than law enforcement. It required the cooperation and resilience of the people themselves. Slowly, businesses reopened, schools regained their rhythm, and the riverside promenade once again filled with pedestrians. Yet even in moments of apparent calm, there was an undercurrent of wariness, a recognition that the city's peace was fragile. The story of Liverpool's descent into fear became a cautionary tale. Analysts, criminologists, and journalists examined the events, studying how international criminal networks could infiltrate a city, exploit weaknesses, and manipulate ordinary life. The lessons were clear. No city is immune, no neighborhood too small, and no system too secure. The syndicates had relied on secrecy, intimidation, and corruption to gain power, and their influence had been magnified by the blind spots within institutions and society. Understanding how the crime rings had operated became as important as the arrests themselves, for it was knowledge that could prevent similar crises in the future. Yet despite the lingering shadows, Liverpool demonstrated resilience. Citizens returned to the streets with cautious optimism. Businesses reopened, and the city's rhythm slowly returned. The docks, once a symbol of illicit activity, now bustled with legitimate trade, and law enforcement maintained a heightened presence to prevent any resurgence. Liverpool had faced an unprecedented challenge, confronting a network of international crime and internal betrayal, and had emerged with its spirit intact. The city had been terrorized, tested, and transformed. Liverpool's people had lived through violence, deception, and fear, yet they endured. The streets were quieter now, but the memory of what had occurred lingered, a permanent reminder that darkness could reach even the most familiar places. The city had survived, but it had learned an unshakable truth. Vigilance was essential, courage indispensable, and the shadows, though diminished, would never fully disappear.